Right, after that messy start. So what causes economic crises? Now, a conventional explanation that I can see has become popular with the government of Ecuador recently is that it's too much government spending. That is often what mainstream economists will blame for causing a crisis. But to actually make a decision like that, I think you need to look at the data going back as far as you can. And we now have data going back over 200 years in economics, at least for America and the United Kingdom, which were the world's two major capitalist economies. And this is the American data for the level of government debt, which is the red line, and the rate of change of that debt, which is the blue line. So the first is the outstanding stock of debt, the second is the change in debt as a percentage of GDP, going back over 220 years. And we know, of course, there are two major economic crises in the history of America: the Great Depression in the 1930s and the 2008 crisis. What we've forgotten is there was also a very severe crisis in America in 1837. If you look in Wikipedia, you'll see it called the Panic of 1837. And it lasted quite a few years, very severe downturn. Now, if you take a look at the data about government spending and about the level of government debt, you find that it doesn't make much sense, because for the two crises we know of, in 1929 and 2007, the level of government debt was actually falling before the crisis started. That's the level of government debt in America between 1920 and 1930, and for that whole period, the American government ran a surplus of 1% of GDP. Now, if you take the conventional argument that the government should run a surplus, that should have been the precursor to a fantastic period in the economy. In fact, it was a precursor to the Great Depression. Take a look at the recent history, and even though America made the ridiculous mistake of invading Iraq, and that cost a large amount of money and drove the deficit up, even for that period of time, government debt was predominantly falling during the 1990s. Now again, you might think, and the early 2000s, you might think that should mean good economic times ahead. In fact, that was also a precursor to a major crisis. Now, government debt began to rise not before the crisis, but after it. So it's very hard to say increase in government debt caused the crisis, when the crisis came before the increase in debt. And that applies in both those crises we know something about. It also, when you look back in the earlier one that most of us have forgotten, the Panic of 1837, not only did government debt fall before that crisis, it fell to zero. And after the crisis, there was no increase in debt, in private debt, in government debt. So the story that government debt causes crises doesn't look very good when you compare it to the economic data. Now, I focus upon private debt, and there the data supports the story. The red line here is the level of private debt compared to GDP in America, and the blue line is the annual change in private debt, which I define as credit. So I call the amount of outstanding debt just simply private debt, and the annual change in that debt I call credit, and I'll explain why I call it credit later. And there, if you take a look at it, you see that private debt was rising before each of the crises. There's the 1920s, when private debt went from about 50% of GDP to 90%. That's using statistics which are made to overlap with the current definitions of private debt. The actual recorded level by the United States Census Department was higher than that, but this is to make the two data series coincide. Same thing during the 1990s and the 2000s. We seem to have forgotten this now, but the 1990s was what was called the telecommunications bubble, and the 2000s was called the subprime bubble, the dot-com, the subprime. Private debt rose dramatically in America across that period, from 120% of GDP to 170%. And it also rose before the crisis of 1837. So in all three cases, there's rising private debt before the crisis. Again, in all three cases, private debt fell during and after the crisis, quite substantially during the Great Depression, a bit during our most recent crisis, from 170% of GDP to 150%, and it also fell quite substantially from 60 to 30% of GDP back in the crisis of 1837. And the really important point I want you to focus on in this graph is that the change in debt, which I define as credit, became substantially negative in each of those three crises, more so than any time in the history of American capitalism. So, back in the crisis of 1837, the annual change in debt, which is credit, was negative 10% of GDP for several years. The same thing during the Great Depression. Not as deep during the 2007-8 crisis, but still negative credit, minus 6% of GDP at the deepest level. So this story fits the data rather better than the story that blames the government for crises. And what's the mechanism? Well, it starts from something that is absolutely critical to macroeconomics, but it's misunderstood by most macroeconomists as well. Not just conventional economists, but also the non-orthodox post-Keynesian groups that I am part of didn't understand how this integrated with credit until recently as well. Expenditure is income. What you spend becomes income for somebody else. That's an absolute given. And they are identical. Our measurements might differ a bit, but fundamentally, your expenditure becomes income for somebody else. And that's whether you are a person, or a firm, or an overseas buyer, or a government. What you spend becomes income for somebody else. And broadly speaking, there are two sources of what you can spend. You can spend money you currently have. So that's the turnover of existing money. And that's what Milton Friedman called the stock of money, M, multiplied by the velocity of turnover, V. So far I'm consistent with Milton Friedman. Not a very comfortable place for me, but I'll move on. Then there's new money. Now, new money can be created in three ways. Exports can exceed imports, and obviously for Ecuador that's absolutely critical because you export and you import in American dollars. So the gap between exports and imports is one way to have more money in Ecuador if you have more exports than imports, but equally, if imports exceed exports, American dollars leave Ecuador. So one way to create more money is to have exports exceed imports. And we count that already in GDP. If you know your formula for gross domestic product, we define it as being consumption plus investment plus exports minus imports plus government spending minus taxation. So that's the next way. Government spending can be greater than taxation. And equally, if government taxation is greater than spending, that reduces GDP. That's already counted. It's already in the way we think about the macroeconomy and GDP. One we don't count is banks can lend more than they get back in repayments. Now, of course, we do record that, but we don't record it independently as part of GDP. We don't include it. So the two of the three ways to create money we have included in our macroeconomic theory. Talking in terms of nominal GDP, we haven't incorporated the role of bank lending. But when you look at the actual behaviour of the economy, a boom in the economy is almost always caused by banks lending much more than they're getting back in repayments. And a slump occurs when the opposite happens, when the rate of growth of debt slows down and when repayments exceed new loans. And even though economists have ignored this, really for the history of economics, ever since Irving Fisher in many, many ways, only rebels have looked at this. Irving Fisher, Hyman Minsky, people like that have looked at this. Conventional economists ignore what banks do completely. But if you look at the data and say, what's the correlation between credit, which is the annual change in private debt, or equivalent to the annual change in private debt, and economic indicators like unemployment, you find the correlation is overwhelming. But according to conventional economists, they assume this correlation is not significantly different from zero. So here's the data for America. And in America, the annual change in private debt, which is equivalent to credit, changed from plus 15% of GDP in 2008 to minus 6% in 2010. and unemployment went in the opposite direction. So the red line is credit now, the annual change in private debt. The blue line is the unemployment rate. And the correlation there is staggering, minus 0.89. And I'll show you later in the slides that conventional economists like Ben Bernanke and Paul Krugman assume it's zero, or not significantly different from zero. So the conventional belief is massively contradicted by the data, and we need to know why. This is Japan, from plus 27% in 1990, before its crisis began, to minus 13% in 2000. And that correlation, again, is huge, minus 0.91. Not the sort of thing you should ignore. Spain, from plus 36% of GDP in 2007 to minus 19% in 2014. So when credit goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. And this applies across the planet to any country with a high level of private debt. Now, for you in Ecuador, that's not Ecuador. Ecuador's got a very low level of private debt. So what I'm talking about here is not something that's affecting Ecuador particularly, but it's what's affecting the rest of the world. And as well as driving unemployment and macroeconomic indicators, it drives finance markets as well. Now, if you've learned conventional finance, you would have learned what's called the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis, which fundamentally says the level of debt has no impact upon the value of assets. That is nonsense. The empirical data shows you an enormous correlation between mortgage debt and house prices. This is the change in new mortgages correlated with the change in house prices, a correlation of 0.8. And it's not quite as high, but a similar correlation applies for change in new margin debt and change in share prices. So the conventional hypothesis is strongly contradicted by the data. We need an alternative hypothesis. The same thing for Japan. This is going back from 1970 until today, so 50-something years of economic data. Not as quite a high correlation, still positive, but for most of that period, Japanese house prices, which is the blue line, have been negative, falling. And you still find this correlation applying. Spain, only a small amount of data here, only the last 10 years, but the same basic story. Asset prices are driven by change in private debt. So what's going on? Well, the causal mechanism is that credit is part of aggregate demand, and I'll explain how that works later in my presentation. It's not the largest component, but it's by far the most volatile. And therefore, because it's more volatile, it has more impact upon the data than the other components of expenditure. And you can have a crisis even if everything else is growing, if credit turns in the opposite direction. And the scale of the effect depends on how large private debt is compared to GDP and how fast it's changing. So I'll give you an example that's relevant to somewhere like Ecuador, because Ecuador's private debt level at the moment is only about 30% of GDP, which is quite tiny compared to the rest of the world. So imagine an economy like your own with a small level of private debt. And I'm going to use a hypothetical economy with a GDP of $1 trillion. So the existing money is turning over and generating $1 trillion worth of demand every year. And it's growing at 10%, so a 10% rate of nominal growth of GDP. And then I'm going to take the example of private debt being 50% of GDP, which is more than applies in Ecuador. So in this example, that means a level of private debt of $500 billion. And imagine that's growing at 20% per annum. Now in Ecuador's case, your private debt's only growing at about 2% of GDP per annum, which is quite low. But plenty of countries that I've already shown you had private debt growing by 20% or more in a single year. So this is quite a realistic example, but with a country with a very low level of private debt. The total demand in that economy, according to the logic I'll explain to you shortly, is $1.1 trillion. $1 trillion from the turnover of existing money, and $100 billion extra from new demand from credit, from newly created money created by new debt. Now, imagine the economy just keeps on growing, 10% increase in GDP the next year. That gives you a turnover of existing money of 1.1 trillion. And imagine that the rate of growth of debt slows down to only 10%. So rather than increasing by 20% every year, debt is just growing by 10%. Well, it starts at $600 billion. 10% of 600 billion is 60 billion. So total demand is 1.1 trillion from turnover of existing money, plus 60 billion more from credit. That gives you total demand in the second year of $1.16 trillion. That's 60 billion more than the year before. So the total demand is still growing. Now let's take a look at an example that applies to most of the rest of the world. America, the UK, most of Europe, Canada, Australia, China, all have debt levels of around 200% of GDP or more. So imagine the same story. The GDP of the actual economy is 1 trillion, so existing money is turning over and generating $1 trillion worth of demand each year, and that's growing at 10%. Private debt is 200% of GDP, that is $2 trillion. And that's growing at 20%, so 20% of 2 trillion is $400 billion. So total demand in this economy is $1.4 trillion, much more demand than in the economy with the low level of debt. So this economy might look like it's booming compared to the low debt example. Next year, same story, GDP grows by 10%, so turnover of existing money the next year is 1.1 trillion. Now, if growth of debt slows down to the same rate that the GDP is growing, so the debt to GDP ratio stabilises, that means a 10% growth in $2.4 trillion worth of debt, which is $240 billion additional. If you add that to the new GDP, you get $1.34 trillion of demand. That is $60 billion lower than the year before. So even though credit is still positive, debt is still increasing, but not increasing faster than GDP, total demand in the economy falls. So you can have a crisis in demand even if debt continues to grow. And in the examples I've shown you beforehand, credit turned negative. So both the level of private debt and the rate of growth of private debt matter. And you get into what we can call a danger zone when the level of private debt is 1.5 times GDP or more, and where credit demand is equivalent to 10% of GDP per year or more. And of course, that's well out of the bounds for Ecuador. Okay? You have 1/5 the level of private debt and 1/5 the rate of growth compared to what I'm talking about here. So Ecuador is not in any danger whatsoever. You need to develop a financial sector rather than tame the financial sector. But here's the danger zone back in 2008, 2007. And you'll see that a whole lot of countries that had a crisis, United States, United Kingdom, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, the Netherlands, a few countries that are in there that didn't have a crisis, but all those countries, the major ones that had a crisis, were all in this danger zone. And the way they get into the danger zone, they have a rising level of debt and a rising level of credit, so they come in through this side of the box. Then when the crisis hits, they fall out this side. So here's Japan, because Japan's crisis was back in 1990, 17 years before the global financial crisis. So you have a high level of debt and high credit causing debt to rise, and you go in through that side of the box. And when you have the crisis, you fall out the other side, down the bottom. That's what clearly happened to Japan before the crisis in 2007. It's what happened to America and the UK, Ireland, Spain, and the Netherlands to some extent during the crisis. Now, countries like my own home country of Australia were in that box but managed to avoid a crisis. How did they do it? They continued borrowing money. So now this is looking at today's data, or data 3 months ago, and seeing who's in the danger zone now. Well, the country that wasn't there beforehand is China, Hong Kong as well. Ireland is back there again. Korea, Singapore, Canada, Belgium, Norway, Sweden and Australia are all in that danger zone. And they're all going through some form of adjustment right now. Whereas the countries that had a crisis back in 2008, they're now outside that box. And they're suffering not from what Larry Summers calls secular stagnation, they're suffering from credit stagnation, because credit demand is far lower now in those countries than it was before the crisis. So there's the United States, there's the UK, and there's Spain. In all cases, they're running very close to zero credit. So credit demand is quite stifled in those economies. So why did the mainstream not look at this data? This is all data that's collected by public institutions like the Bank of International Settlements or the Federal Reserve. The data was there to be looked at if you knew to look. Why did they ignore it? It's because conventional economics has models of how banks behave that ignore banks themselves and say banks are just like an introduction agency. Banks don't actually lend money, they introduce somebody who saves to somebody who wants to borrow, and they charge a fee. That's called the loanable funds model. Or you have the model called the money multiplier, or fractional reserve banking, that says that the amount of money that banks can create is controlled by the government. Now, they're both myths. These are both fictitious, false models of how banks behave. And I've been part of a group of economists which have been saying this for 50 years. Normally I've got to quote my friends. Now I can quote the Bank of England, because the Bank of England came out in 2014 and said how money is created today differs from the description found in some economics textbooks. That's really almost all economics textbooks. Rather than banks receiving deposits when households save and then lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. That's from the Bank of England. And they also say that banks do not multiply up central bank money, nor is central bank money multiplied up into more loans and deposits, contradicting what's in your textbooks. Your textbooks are wrong. And it's not just rebel economists like myself and Pablo saying that, it's the Bank of England and Germany's Bundesbank, which you would think is the most conservative central bank on the planet. They're saying your textbooks are wrong. So your textbooks have to change, or you have to get new textbooks. This is the Bundesbank. Banks create book money just by making an accounting entry. Now, because the mainstream ignores these theories, they've ignored previous theoreticians who've looked at the role of private debt. So Irving Fisher developed what is called the debt deflation theory of Great Depressions. And this is Ben Bernanke, who's supposed to be the expert on what causes Great Depressions. And he rejected Fisher out of hand by saying debt deflation is no more than a redistribution from one group, debtors, to another group, creditors. And said unless there's huge differences in how much those two groups spend, pure redistributions should have no significant macroeconomic effect. So he ignored Irving Fisher and he ignored private debt as an explanation for the Great Depression. This is Paul Krugman, and Paul Krugman talking about how much after the crisis people spoke about private debt. And he therefore says, well, you might think that economists model it, but he then says, somewhat surprisingly, it is quite common to abstract altogether from this feature of the economy. So economists don't talk about private debt when they model the macroeconomy. Now, if the myths were true, that wouldn't be a problem, but they're false. So what you have is mainstream economics ignoring crucial economic data. So how do they create money? Well, the usual story is banks lend out deposits. I can just tell you the Bundesbank says that's nonsense. They don't do that. What they do instead, when they lend you money, they put money in your bank account, which is their liability, and they record an asset against you, which is the debt. They simultaneously create both debt and money, which is why I define credit as the rate of change of debt, of private debt. And this is modelling that phenomenon in my software package Minsky, which, as Pablo said, is free. You can download it from a place called SourceForge for free and install it and play with it yourself. But the fundamental operation here, I have 5 accounts. I have bank reserves, loans to firms, both of which are assets of the banking sector, bank accounts for firms, bank accounts for workers, which are liabilities of the banking sector, and the bank's own equity, which is the gap between its assets and its liabilities. And that's called the fundamental equation of accounting. That equation means that assets minus liabilities minus equity must be zero, and my software package checks to make sure that applies to each line, otherwise your equation is wrong. Now, to create new money, all the banks have to do is record a loan on one side of the ledger, the asset, and put the same amount of money on the liability side. That's all there is to the banks creating money. It's incredibly simple. And notice reserves play no role. Nothing is happening in the reserves column. The reserves are there for bank transfers and if you want to get cash out and for the interaction between the private banks and the government. But it's not needed for lending. So, how is money created? It's created because banks are given a license to create money. That's what a bank license is. It enables somebody to create money. So that's a social right that they're given that they should use in a socially responsible way. And the fact we had the crisis in 2007 and all those ones since means they haven't done it. They don't do this responsibly. Now, the expansion and the contraction of that money is what caused the booms and busts in the economy. And what they're limited by is not reserves, but more their willingness to leverage up the equity they currently have. If they are only comfortable to have 10 times as many loans as they have equity, they create a small amount of money. If they're willing to have 30 times as much loans as they have equity, they can create a huge amount of money. Of course, in the former case, they're insulated to some extent from asset prices plunging. In the latter case, a small fall in asset prices can make those banks go bankrupt, and that's what happened back in 2008. So I model that process in my software package Minsky. I won't show you this one given how long this presentation is, but I'll show you another model in a short while. So how do the crises happen? Well, the person who really worked out what causes a crisis most clearly was Hyman Minsky. And if you haven't read Minsky, I highly recommend doing it. The best book to read on Hyman Minsky is a book of short essays called Can It Happen Again? Quite cheap, short essays, very, very well written. He has another book called Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. I would recommend not reading that book. It's not very well written. His best book is called John Maynard Keynes. And that might sound like a biography to you, but it's actually, the title is a tribute to Keynes. It's where Minsky explains his theory best. But his punchline was this one. He said the fundamental instability of a capitalist economy is upward. Tendency to transform doing well into a speculative investment boom is the basic instability in a capitalist economy. And the basic mechanics are that borrowers, which can be firms or households, commit to a debt during a boom, but the boom changes distribution of income. And debt ratchets up in a series of booms and slumps because people commit to debt during a boom, they can't repay it during a slump, so the debt tends to go wobble, wobble, wobble up at higher and higher levels, and you finally get a crisis. Now I can illustrate this with an incredibly simple model that is directly derived from macroeconomic definitions. So if I take the employment rate, which is the number of people who have a job divided by the population, the wages share of GDP, which is the wage bill divided by GDP, and the ratio of private debt to GDP, which is simply how much debt exists divided by GDP. They're strict definitions. Now, if I then add very simple linear equations for how workers react to the level of unemployment in terms of their wage demands, and how capitalists react to the level of profit in terms of their desire to invest, I ignore, for this simple model, what's called Ponzi lending, which is lending for speculation and gambling, doesn't actually produce any additional output. Ignoring that and putting this model together, and now I'm going to simulate this in my software package Minsky, I have a very simple set of equations, which are shown over here. Let's actually drag that over a bit so you can see it more clearly. So I have a velocity of turnover of 3, interest rate of 5%, a rate of growth of labour productivity of 1.5% per annum, a rate of growth of population of 1.5%, depreciation of 6%, simple linear function for how workers react to the employment rate, another one for how capitalists react to the rate of profit, and 3 simple equations for the debt level, the employment rate, and the wages share of GDP, all derived from definitions. If I simulate this and I have a low level of desire to invest by capitalists, what you get is a system that stabilises ultimately. You get cycles in employment, cycles in wages share of GDP, a rising level of debt, but the rising level of debt stabilises too at a low level of GDP, about 40% of GDP, which is much the level you have in Ecuador. So that's a stable economy. But if I have what you'd actually like to have, you'd like to have capitalists who are very willing to invest. So if I increase the level of investment that capitalists wish to have, given the rate of profit, you get a very different dynamic. Notice you have diminishing cycles in employment and falling wages share, but also diminishing cycles in wages share, and I can show later that is actually what determines the rate of inflation. So if a conventional economist looking at this data would think, great, this is so wonderful. Cycles are falling in employment, cycles are falling in inflation, inflation is trending down, everything looks tremendous. The economy is doing very well, let's call this the Great Moderation. What they're ignoring is this data here, the level of private debt, which is getting much higher than in the previous simulation. It's rising in a series of cycles as well, and as that keeps on going, rather than cycles getting smaller, they start getting bigger. Now that's a very stylised version of what we actually went through in the financial crisis. We had diminishing cycles in employment giving way to larger cycles, including very high unemployment, falling inflation leading to deflation, and a rising level of private debt. That is all what we saw in the real data. So that's exactly the same model, just different parameters for how much capitalists are willing to borrow money when they wish to invest. Now, if I include a more complex model with non-linear behaviour by workers with respect to the inflation, the employment rate, and capitalists with respect to investment, I get a model that, again, the same sort of basic dynamics, but it's more headed towards the downside. And if I go slightly more complicated in the model and include price dynamics as well, I get a system where for a while the unemployment rate cycles more vigorously, then it stabilises and you think everything's fantastic, then the economy collapses. Wages share of GDP also declines and you have deflation. And from the point of view of investors and capitalists, there's a whole lot of cyclical behaviour. Then the economy stabilises, isn't it great, and suddenly their profit share collapses. What's driving the problem, which is down here, is an increasing level of private debt. More and more going to bankers, less and less going to workers, and finally the economy being overwhelmed by the level of debt that it's taken on. So you get these three phenomena coming out of that very simple model derived directly from definitions. You have a rising level of private debt to GDP, an apparent moderation before the crisis, and rising inequality, with capitalist income being stable before the collapse and more money going to bankers and less going to workers. Now, all that happened in America over that time period, and economists, mainstream economists, called the period of diminishing cycles the Great Moderation. So you see inflation fell in a series of cycles from plus 15% down to 2, and they thought that was because how well they were managing the economy. Unemployment went from cycles of 11% to 8% to 6%, and they were triumphant. They thought the economy was doing fantastically, and then this happened. The reason was they ignored this piece of data, the level of private debt to GDP. which was climbing all the way through and then plunged after the crisis. That's what their theory told them to ignore, and their theory led them astray. So we have to include private debt in how we think about the economy. We have to include credit as well. And once you do that, it's no longer a surprise that the crisis occurred. It was inevitable, given the high level of private debt that the Western economies had got themselves into, and the dependence they had upon more and more credit demand. And you can see this in all the countries that had a crisis in 2007, and you can see it in Japan as well. The countries that avoided a crisis did not experience negative credit. Not that that's a good thing. I'll explain why later. Here's the United States. Debt and credit from 1945 to today, rising all the way through. Positive credit all the way from 1945 right out to 2007, and then it goes negative. That's when the crisis occurred. Japan, with the crisis back in 1990. Same story. Rising private debt, then credit going from very positive to very negative, and a crisis which lasted 20 years, 25 years. Spain, enormous increase in private debt after the euro came into existence. Huge increase. Gigantic credit boom, followed by a massive bust. The United Kingdom, no change in debt for many decades, then trebling between Maggie Thatcher and the end of Gordon Brown, and negative credit after the crisis. So it's a global phenomenon. You can find it throughout the world. Ireland is the most ridiculous. No change in private debt between 1970 and 2000, and then private debt rose from 80% of GDP to 330% of GDP. That's when they called themselves the Celtic Tiger. Credit went from almost 60% before the crisis to minus 30 afterwards. Do not do what the Irish did. Now, the countries that avoided a crisis did not have negative credit. So here's China. China had a fairly low level of debt before the crisis. The Communist Party basically told their banks to lend to anybody who was still alive after the crisis to stimulate the economy. So private debt went from about 120% of GDP before the crisis to 220% now. But credit hasn't gone negative yet. Korea, which is one of the countries I think will have a crisis very shortly, from 140% to 200%, and credit is still positive. Canada, which appears to be falling into a crisis right now, rising private debt, positive credit, no negative credit yet, but I think it's on its way, and the same for Australia. Credit rising after the global financial crisis from 180% to 200% of GDP. Credit started to head negative, and then government policy encouraged people to borrow money again, and they didn't experience negative credit. But I think they will shortly. And when you look at countries that completely avoided a crisis, what they have is low levels of private debt and credit being trivial. This is Germany, which of course has a huge trade surplus courtesy of the euro. Its private debt is below 150% of GDP, and credit is trivial. So that's the background, that we have to include private debt in how we think about the economy. Now, one other thing we have to get our heads around is what is savings? And everybody thinks saving is a good idea. Well, this is a great idea for an individual. It's a lousy idea for an economy, and I want to show you why. Because if you're going to save money, somebody else has to reduce their savings by just as much as you increase yours. All savings actually does at the macroeconomic level is slow down how fast money turns over. And what you're doing effectively by saving is reducing the productivity of money. You get less GDP for the same amount of money. So I want to give you an illustration of that using both logic and my Minsky software as well. Imagine an economy that has $300 billion of cash and it turns over twice a year. So your GDP is $600 billion per year. Well, let's divide that economy into three groups. And I could use any three groups at all. I could use private sector, government sector, foreign sector. Here I'm using poor households, rich households and firms. Any three divisions will show you the same logic. So imagine each group has $100 billion in savings and they're each spending $100 billion on each other. What happens if one of those groups decides to try to save $10 billion per year? Well, we're starting from this position. This is showing expenditure and income in one table. And the poor are spending $100 billion per year on the rich and $100 billion per year on the firms. The rich are doing the same on the poor and the firms are doing the same on the poor and the rich. So across the diagonal, you have expenditure. And total expenditure is one way of measuring GDP. So you have a GDP of 600 billion. Now, what you spend becomes income for somebody else. So if you measure the off-diagonal elements, you also get $600 billion. Expenditure is necessarily the same as income. Now let's imagine next year the poor households decide to save $5 billion per year. So rather than spending $100 billion per year on the other two, they spend 95. That means poor households spend 190. They still get an income of 200, so they save 10. That's great. The rich households, income has fallen by 5. They're earning 195. They're spending 200. They dissave by 5. And the same for the firms. Now what's actually happened to GDP courtesy of that? Total savings is still 0. GDP has fallen by 10 billion. That's exactly as much as poor households are trying to save. So saving at the individual level becomes a fall in GDP at the national level. That's what Keynes called the paradox of thrift. Now, if the rich households and the firms decide to match what the poor households have done and also spend less, you get back to balance. Nobody is saving money anymore, but GDP has fallen by $30 billion. So for one group to save, another group has to dissave. And I'll show you this in Minsky as well. So I've set this up in a Minsky model. And this very special thing about Minsky is it includes a way of modelling what banks do and what financial flows using double entry bookkeeping. So here's a little table showing that each group has $100 billion in savings. So total reserves of the banking sector are $300 billion. The poor spend on the rich and the poor spend on firms. The rich spend on the poor and the rich spend on firms. The firms spend on the poor and the firms spend on the rich. Simple little model like that. And over here, I can change how much is being spent by moving this slider. So I'm going to simulate it first of all with each group spending $100 billion on the others each year. And what you get is bank accounts stay at $100 billion and GDP is $600 billion. And nobody is saving money. Now what I'm going to do is have this poor households go from spending $100 billion per year to $95 billion per year on each of the other two groups. And what you see is, yes, they're saving money, but the other two groups are dissaving by exactly as much, and GDP has fallen by 10. And if you have the same happen with the rich households and the firms, then that attempt to save money has actually only reduced GDP by exactly the same amount. If you want GDP to rise, you actually want people to spend more money. So if I now have them spending more, you get an increase in GDP. Now that's what Keynes called the paradox of thrift. You actually don't want people to save money at the macroeconomic level. So we have to balance our desire for savings with our need for more expenditure for income to grow. And we haven't done that successfully. Now if you look at the United States, what I've simulated there appears to have been happening for the last virtually 40 years. This is the broadest measure of money in America, called MZM, money of zero maturity. And that rose from turning over twice per annum back in the 1960s to 3.5 times in the 1980s, and it's plunged all the way down to about 1.3 times now, which means Americans are getting much less bang for each buck. They're much more reliant upon credit for their economy to continue growing, which is why they're in a crisis. So, if you want to have aggregate savings occurring every year, you have to have somebody else dis-saving every year. And again, there are three candidates. The foreign sector can dis-save if they buy more from you than you buy from them. Exports exceed imports. And clearly that's the case for Ecuador because you're using the American dollar to both buy and sell. And that creates money for the other groups. So a trade surplus for you means you can have increasing bank accounts for households, governments and firms. And you're creating net financial assets for your economy because there's no debt associated with the additional money. The banking sector, in a sense, dis-saves when it lends more than it gets back in repayments. Now that creates money for you, but it creates an identical amount of debt for you. So you have no increase in your net financial assets. Or the government can spend more than it gets back in taxation. Now that increases money for households and firms without creating any debt. So it's net financial assets for the private sector. The only question is, how does the government handle the debt that it creates? So if you want to have savings, you have to have somebody else just saving. There's no choice. You simply have to work out how that is done. So the lessons from all this is, first of all, don't ignore private debt and credit the way mainstream economists do. We have to take it seriously. It has to be part of any macroeconomic model that describes a capitalist economy. And prevent credit being used for asset bubbles, because that increasing leverage is actually what causes the asset prices to rise and leads ultimately to a crisis when those asset prices start falling. So you have a feedback loop from higher prices to higher debt. Finally, the debt stops growing, prices crash. Learn from countries that have limited the amount of speculation that occurs. Singapore and Germany have real estate systems in particular that make it very unattractive to borrow money and gamble on house prices rising. And most fundamentally, don't let the financial sector take over your economy. Don't become like America, where the finance sector tells the political class what to do. Because they're not geniuses, they are not masters of the universe. They are people who got a banking license, and 90% of them don't actually know how they create money in the first place. It's the license that society gives them that lets them create money, that gives them that power. They should be servants, not masters. And develop a financial system which promotes circulation of money. Make that an important objective. Focusing upon saving money will actually reduce your GDP. And that applies if the government reduces its spending as well, which you're about to experience. And develop a way of thinking about the economy that is monetary and not fixated on equilibrium. The biggest mistake economics has done is stick with the 19th century belief that everything happens in equilibrium or near it, when the real world is far from equilibrium. And we now have modelling techniques, as I've shown you with Minsky a moment ago, which engineers developed over 50 years ago, that can handle non-equilibrium systems. Economists should start using them. And the very first step in realising how to control the economy when it's unstable is to appreciate that it is not stable. It doesn't tend to equilibrium. And with that insight, we can now model it successfully. To do that, we need a new approach to economics, and that's where the forum comes in particular for Ecuador that Pablo's established. Join that forum, help promote a new, realistic approach to economics. And maybe you might help me out as well with my public funding of my work as a campaigner for reform in economics. Thank you.
Yes, of course. In this moment I will read in Spanish.
Yeah, sure.
Bien, felicitamos al profesor King por esa magnífica y excelente presentación. Voy a dar lectura a algunas de las preguntas Iré una por una para que el doctor pueda respondernos. Muchas gracias a todos por su participación. Doctor King, voy a hacerlas en español, pues tú habrá la traducción. Una de las primeras preguntas es si usted podría darnos